When wealthy socialite Vivian Grant invited her maid's young son to play chess at one of her elegant soirees, it was meant as nothing more than a cruel joke, a way to amuse her guests by watching a child stumble across the board. But what began as laughter turned into stunned silence when the boy's every move revealed something extraordinary. Piece by piece, strategy by strategy, this nobody dismantled her ego, her pride, and her carefully constructed world. What she thought would be entertainment became a revelation, and a humiliation she would never forget. Vivian Grant's mansion was the kind of place people whispered about before they even set foot inside. Marble columns, chandeliers that spilled light like waterfalls of crystal, and velvet curtains that muffled the sounds of the outside world. It was a palace of indulgence, a shrine to wealth and status. On that particular evening, Vivian was hosting one of her famous soirees. The city's elite, bankers, lawyers, politicians, art collectors, mingled over champagne and hors d'oeuvres. A grand piano played softly in the corner, while guests discussed investments, gallery openings, and the latest gossip from Wall Street. Vivian loved these nights. They were her stage, her chance to dazzle, to remind everyone she wasn't just rich, she was cultured, refined, above them all. As usual, the maid, Denise, moved silently in the background, ensuring every guest was served. Her presence, though indispensable, was almost invisible, except for the child that trailed close behind her, clutching a small, worn-out book. Denise's son, Jamal, had begged to come along. She usually left him with a neighbor, but tonight she hadn't managed to find anyone. Reluctantly, she had brought him, instructing him to sit quietly and not get in the way. He did as told, sitting on a small stool in the kitchen doorway, flipping through his battered book, while his mother carried trays back and forth. It was during a lull in the evening when Vivian noticed him. She tilted her glass of wine, smirking as her friends gathered around her, and said loudly enough for the nearby guests to hear, "Tell me, Denise, is your boy learning anything useful in that little public school of his, or is he just wasting time like most children do?" Denise froze, unsure how to respond. "He's a bright boy, ma'am," she said cautiously, her eyes fixed on the floor. Vivian chuckled, exchanging a conspiratorial glance with her circle of friends. Her gaze drifted to the ornate chess set displayed on a side table near the window. Its pieces were carved from ivory and onyx, an imported set she often used to showcase her sophistication. "You know what would be amusing," Vivian declared, her voice loud enough to hush the room. "Let's have your son play a game of chess. Against me." A ripple of laughter spread among the guests. To them it was absurd. A little boy against the hostess, a woman who boasted of her cleverness and skill. They expected an easy, almost comedic performance, Vivian teaching the maid's son a lesson in intelligence. Denise's face paled. "Ma'am, he's just a child." But before she could finish, Jamal closed his book, stood up, and walked forward. His small frame looked even smaller against the grandeur of the room, but his eyes, dark, steady, and focused, didn't waver. "I'll play," he said simply. The room erupted in chuckles and whispers. Vivian raised an eyebrow, amused by his boldness. "Well then," she said, settling into the high-backed chair by the chess table, "let's give the boy his moment, shall we?" Jamal slid into the opposite seat. The ivory and onyx pieces gleamed under the chandelier, pristine and untouched. He placed his small hands on the table, fingers brushing over the pawns as though he'd touched such luxury before. Vivian leaned back with a smile that was both patronizing and confident. "This will be fun," she said, glancing at her guests. "A little show to liven up the night." The audience gathered closer, forming a circle around the table. Champagne glasses clinked as they settled in, ready for the spectacle. In their minds, the ending was already written. A wealthy socialite humiliating a poor maid's son, turning his innocence into entertainment. What none of them knew was that the boy wasn't afraid. In fact, Jamal's mind was already racing, mapping out possibilities, seeing the board not as a game, but as a battlefield. While they laughed, he calculated. While they smirked, he prepared. The game hadn't even begun, and yet the balance of power was already shifting, only nobody realized it. Not yet. Jamal sat across from Vivian, his legs barely long enough to reach the floor. The chair was too big for him, the table too tall, but his posture was steady, and his gaze never faltered. Around him, the laughter of the guests lingered, light and mocking, as though the outcome had already been decided. To them, this was nothing more than theatre, a child entertaining the wealthy for a few minutes before being dismissed. Vivian smirked, swirling her wine in one hand. "All right, young man, let's see what you can do." She opened the board with a flourish, moving her pawn 2 spaces forward, as though announcing to the crowd that the game, and her inevitable victory, had begun. The guests murmured in approval, some already exchanging jokes. But Jamal didn't laugh. He leaned forward, studying the board carefully. His small fingers hovered over the pawns, and for a moment he seemed almost lost in thought, as if the ivory and onyx pieces whispered secrets only he could hear. Then, with calm precision, he pushed his own pawn forward. It wasn't the clumsy, hesitant move they had expected. It was deliberate, purposeful, a classic opening. The room went quiet for a beat, though Vivian brushed it off with a wave of her hand. "Beginner's luck," she said with a smile, moving her next piece. But Jamal countered quickly, smoothly, with the ease of someone who had spent hours, days, maybe years, studying the game in silence. Denise stood at the edge of the room, her tray trembling slightly in her hands. She wanted to intervene, to tell her son to stop before he embarrassed himself further. Yet there was something in his posture, in the way he leaned toward the board, that made her hesitate. This wasn't the nervous boy she'd raised alone in the shadows of other people's wealth. This was someone different, someone entirely at home in this battle of minds. "Where did he learn that?" whispered one guest. Another shrugged. "Probably just stumbled onto it. Even a broken clock is right twice a day." But Jamal kept moving, each decision calculated, each motion crisp. He wasn't rushing, nor was he intimidated by Vivian's theatrics. Every time she slammed down a piece with exaggerated flair, he responded with quiet certainty, as though he had already anticipated her move before she made it. Vivian, on the other hand, was starting to notice. The smile that had once radiated confidence began to tighten at the corners. Her friends leaned closer, whispering now, not with amusement, but with curiosity. "Do you play often?" Vivian asked, her tone dripping with condescension. Jamal didn't look up. His eyes stayed on the board. "Every day," he said softly. A few guests chuckled. "With who? His school friends?" one man joked. Jamal finally raised his gaze, his voice clear and steady. "With myself. I study books, strategies, endgames. I learned from masters who played before I was born." There was no boast in his tone, no arrogance. It was simply the truth. Vivian blinked, taken aback, but quickly regained her composure. "Well, theory is one thing, boy. Winning is another." She advanced her queen aggressively, forcing a reaction. Jamal glanced at the board, tilted his head slightly, then moved his knight in a way that made 2 of the older gentlemen in the back exchange startled glances. That's the Nimzovich defense," one of them muttered under his breath. "Unorthodox, but brilliant if played right." Nobody laughed this time. Denise's heart swelled with something she hadn't expected, pride. For years she had worried about her son's obsession with books and chessboards scavenged from second-hand shops. She'd feared he would be mocked, overlooked, lost in a world that didn't value boys like him. Yet here he was, commanding attention in the grandest room she had ever seen, and doing so with nothing but his mind. Piece by piece, Jamal was proving he didn't belong in the shadows. And though the match had only just begun, the guests could sense it. This was no accident. This child was not merely playing, he was controlling the game. Vivian shifted in her seat, for the first time feeling something she hadn't expected all evening, unease. The ivory queen gleamed under the chandelier as Vivian moved her piece forward with deliberate confidence. She leaned back, wineglass in hand, giving a smirk to her circle of guests. To her, this was still a performance. A boy with calloused fingers and second-hand shoes could hardly match her years of sophistication and study. But as Jamal leaned forward, the room shifted. The laughter dimmed, the idle chatter fell silent. His eyes scanned the Beatishan, awed in swift arcs, not with the hesitation of a child, but with the precision of a tactician. Then, without a word, he slid his bishop across the polished wood, positioning it in a subtle yet deadly alignment. A few older men exchanged uneasy glances. This wasn't chance, this wasn't fumbling. The boy was weaving a pattern. Vivian chuckled nervously, dismissing her growing unease. "Cute move," she said, feigning indifference. She retaliated with an aggressive push of her rook. Jamal countered instantly, repositioning his knight in a way that revealed foresight. He wasn't reacting, he was predicting. The spectators leaned closer. Crystal glasses hovered in mid-air, their contents forgotten. Every clink of a piece landing on the board echoed through the chamber like a drumbeat. Vivian began to feel the weight of eyes upon her. Her cheeks flushed, though she masked it behind a brittle smile. She was known in her circle as a strategist, a woman of intellect. She had defeated businessmen, lawyers, and visiting scholars at this very board. And yet, across from her sat a boy whose legs barely reached the floor, and she was already playing defensively. She tried to regain control, driving her queen into the fray with force. Jamal didn't flinch. He lifted his pawn, a piece most considered expendable, and advanced it with calm finality. In that single move, he dismantled half her strategy, closing her queen into a trap she hadn't foreseen. A gasp rippled through the crowd. "Impossible," muttered one guest under his breath. Vivian's jaw tightened. She pressed harder, moving quickly now, attempting to overwhelm him with speed, but speed was nothing against precision. Jamal's fingers darted lightly across the pieces, each one flowing into place with a rhythm, a cadence. It was like watching a pianist compose a symphony on the spot. Denise, standing frozen near the doorway, gripped her tray against her chest. Her heart raced with every move, every exchange. She had feared her son would be mocked. Instead, she watched as he dismantled the arrogance of the wealthy piece by piece. The board was no longer a game, it was a battlefield. Vivian's army of ivory pieces advanced in scattered desperation, while Jamal's onyx forces moved like shadows, coordinated and relentless. Whispers turned to silence. Silence turned to awe. Finally, Vivian tried a bold maneuver, sacrificing her knight to open a path. She smirked as if she had regained control, but Jamal's response was immediate. He captured her knight and simultaneously positioned his bishop in such a way that her king's escape routes began to vanish. For the first time that night, Vivian's mask cracked. A bead of sweat slid down her temple. Where did you learn this?" she asked, her voice quieter than before. Jamal looked up at her, his eyes steady and unafraid. "By watching, by reading, by practicing until the board spoke to me." The simplicity of his words struck harder than arrogance ever could. He wasn't boasting, he wasn't mocking her, he was simply stating fact. Vivian's hand trembled as she moved her queen again, but Jamal already knew. With a soft motion, he advanced his rook into place. Gasps echoed around them as the board tightened, her pieces suffocating under his control. The boy wasn't just surviving the match, he was dismantling her completely. And as the game deepened, the question shifted in every guest's mind. No longer would Vivian win, but how long could she last against him? The battle had only just begun, yet everyone knew this night would not end in laughter, it would end in revelation. The atmosphere in the grand hall had transformed. Where moments earlier there had been laughter, chatter, and the clinking of glasses, now there was silence so thick it seemed to press against the walls. All eyes were on the chessboard. Vivian's once smug smile had faded into a tight line. Her wine glass sat abandoned beside her, condensation dripping onto the polished table. The ivory queen she had so confidently advanced earlier was now cornered, immobilized by the boy's relentless strategy. Jamal sat still, his small hands folded loosely before him, his eyes locked on the battlefield of black and white. He didn't fidget, didn't smile, didn't even gloat. He played with the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly where this would end. Vivian leaned forward, her movements growing sharper, less deliberate. She advanced her rook recklessly, trying to force the boy into defense. Jamal glanced at the board, tilted his head, and with one simple move of his knight, dismantled her attack and turned it into a trap. Gasps erupted. "Did you see that?" whispered one man near the back. "He baited her," said another, awe in his voice. "A child just baited her into a textbook blunder." Vivian's cheeks flushed crimson. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the table as she studied the board. She was used to winning, to hearing her guests applaud her cleverness. Yet now she felt the heat of humiliation rising, the weight of dozens of eyes witnessing her unravel. Her friends no longer laughed. Their amusement had soured into unease. Nobody dared mock the boy anymore, because what was unfolding before them was not a joke, it was brilliance. Vivian tried to steady herself. She took a deep breath and pushed forward with her queen, attempting a risky gambit. But Jamal moved instantly, capturing a pawn that simultaneously exposed her rook. The trap was invisible until it snapped shut, and by then it was too late. The crowd erupted again, some in disbelief, others in barely contained excitement. "This child," muttered an older guest, shaking his head. "He's not just talented, he's extraordinary." Denise stood frozen by the door, tears welling in her eyes. She had always known her son was different, that his mind worked in ways others couldn't see. But she had never imagined the world would be forced to recognize it like this, right here, in the heart of a mansion that had always reminded her she was lesser. Vivian's hand trembled as she reached for her bishop. Her voice was quieter now, stripped of its former confidence. "How old are you, boy?" 10, Jamal replied softly, without looking up. He moved his rook, pinning her bishop to her king. Another murmur ran through the crowd. 10, just 10 years old. Vivian's breaths came faster. Her polished exterior was crumbling, the weight of her pride colliding with the reality before her. She was losing, not just the game, but her image, her dignity, her control. "Careful," one of her friends muttered, leaning close. Maybe you should stop." But Vivian couldn't stop. Not now. Not with so many watching. She pressed on, clawing for an escape. Each move became more desperate, more frantic. And each time Jamal met her with calm precision, his dark eyes flickering only with concentration, never with fear. Then came the moment that sealed it. Vivian lunged with her queen in what she thought was a daring attack. Jamal's response was immediate. He slid his bishop diagonally across the board, snapping her queen in a single stroke. The room erupted in gasps loud enough to rattle the chandeliers. Vivian sat back, pale, her mouth slightly open. She had lost her queen, the symbol of her power, her most prized piece, gone in an instant. Jamal lifted his eyes then, just for a moment, and met hers. There was no malice there, no mockery, only quiet certainty. "Check," he said softly. A silence fell so absolute that even the piano in the corner had stopped. Vivian's pride shattered like glass on the floor. Her guests, who had once laughed at the idea of the maid's son playing chess, now stared at him with awe. What had begun as cruelty had turned into revelation. Vivian wasn't entertaining them anymore. The boy was. Vivian's manicured fingers hovered above the board, trembling as though the ivory pieces themselves burned her skin. Around her, the silence was suffocating. The guests, her friends, her peers, her admirers, stood transfixed, watching the once celebrated hostess unravel before their eyes. The woman who prided herself on poise, intellect, and control now sat cornered, her every move dismantled by the boy she had meant to humiliate. Across the table, Jamal sat perfectly still. His small frame barely filled the chair, yet in that moment he looked taller than Vivian herself. His eyes were locked on the board, sharp and unyielding, his hands resting lightly on the edge of the table, as if he had all the time in the world. He wasn't gloating, he wasn't smirking, he was simply waiting for her to see what he already knew. And in that silence, one truth hung heavy in the air. She was not facing a servant's child, she was facing a genius. Vivian's thoughts raced. How had it come to this? She was supposed to crush him in 5 moves, make her guests laugh, remind Denise of her place. But now, with every piece falling against her, the laughter was gone, replaced by whispers of awe, directed not at her, but at the boy. She swallowed hard and advanced her rook, clinging to some shred of dignity. It was a bold move, reckless but desperate, her only hope to delay the inevitable. Jamal's response was instant. He lifted his knight and dropped it onto the board with a soft clack. The guests gasped. Her rook was trapped. Vivian's chest tightened. She tried again, pushing a pawn forward, attempting to shield her king. Jamal barely glanced at the move before sliding his bishop into position. His army closed in like a tightening noose. A bead of sweat rolled down Vivian's temple. She dabbed it away quickly, forcing a smile, but her trembling hand betrayed her. The board was no longer hers. Every line of defense had been stripped away, her knights gone, her queen captured, her pawns scattered like broken soldiers across the battlefield. Only her king remained, boxed in by shadows, suffocating. Her guests leaned in, breaths held, as though the fate of the empire rested on this board. Denise, clutching her tray against her chest, didn't dare blink. Vivian pushed her final pawn forward, a futile attempt to stall. Jamal's eyes narrowed slightly. Then, with quiet grace, he lifted his rook and placed it firmly in the corner of the board. "Checkmate." The word rang through the hall like a bell tolling at dawn, soft, steady, undeniable. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. The chandeliers glowed above them, the piano sat silent in the corner, and time itself seemed to pause. Then the whispers began. He beat her. Impossible. A child just destroyed her. Vivian's face flushed crimson, her polished mask crumbling in front of everyone she had sought to impress. Her lips trembled as she opened them, searching for an excuse, a joke, anything to salvage her pride. But nothing came. The evidence was right there on the board, her king pinned, her army fallen, her reign of superiority dismantled by the maid's son. Jamal leaned back in his chair, his expression calm, almost serene. He wasn't smiling in victory, nor was he rubbing her defeat in her face. To him, this was not about humiliation, it was simply the conclusion of a game well played. He stood, small and unassuming, and quietly stepped back from the table. Denise's eyes brimmed with tears as she set down her tray and clutched her hands together. Her son, her shy, bookish boy, had just humbled the woman who had humiliated them both for years. The guests, still stunned, began to murmur among themselves. But the words had changed. They no longer spoke of Vivian's elegance or wit. They spoke of Jamal, the child genius, the prodigy who had revealed himself in the unlikeliest of ways. Vivian forced a brittle laugh, raising her glass of wine with a hand that shook slightly. "Well," she said, her voice brittle, "that was entertaining." But the room knew better. Her words rang hollow. Everyone had seen what had happened. The millionaire had been dethroned, not by wealth, not by status, but by intellect, and by a boy she had once dismissed as invisible. Jamal glanced at his mother, his dark eyes shining with quiet pride. He had played for more than a win. He had played for her. And as the whispers swirled, one truth settled over the grand hall like an unshakable shadow. Nothing would ever be the same again. The room remained heavy with silence long after the final word, checkmate, had left Jamal's lips. It was the kind of silence that weighed on the air, stretching taut over the chandelier-lit room until every guest felt its pull. No laughter, no applause, just stunned recognition of what had unfolded before them. Vivian Grant, the woman who prided herself on intellect and refinement, sat slumped in her high-backed chair, her face pale. She reached for her wine-glass with a trembling hand, trying to restore the mask of elegance she had worn for years. But the glass shook as she raised it, and even the smallest tremor revealed her humiliation to all. Her friends avoided her gaze. They were no longer amused by her games. Their eyes now followed Jamal as he rose quietly from his chair, small shoulders squared, his expression calm. He hadn't gloated, he hadn't mocked, he had simply won, and that made his victory all the more devastating. Denise moved forward, her eyes wet with pride. She wanted to embrace her son right there, but she held back, aware of the setting. Instead, she rested a hand on his shoulder, her fingers trembling with equal parts relief and triumph. For the first time in years of working for Vivian, she felt something new, dignity. The guests began to murmur, their voices rising in waves of astonishment. A prodigy. Incredible. He played like a master. At his age? Impossible. One man in a tailored suit leaned closer to his companion. I've seen grandmasters who didn't play with that level of foresight. Someone needs to sponsor this boy. Denise's head snapped toward him, her heart pounding. Sponsor? The word lit a spark of hope she hadn't dared dream of. All her life, she had feared Jamal's brilliance would wither in the shadows, ignored because of who he was, where he came from. But now, in this glittering hall of wealth, the world had seen him. They could not see him. Meanwhile, Vivian sat frozen, her lips pressed tight, her mind reeling. She had thought this game would be a joke, a spectacle to amuse her guests at her maid's expense. Instead, it had dismantled her reputation piece by piece, as surely as Jamal had dismantled her queen, her rook, her king. Her humiliation was complete. One of her guests cleared his throat. Vivian, perhaps you've underestimated him. This boy, he could compete, with the right training. Enough! Vivian snapped, her voice sharper than she intended. A hush fell again. She glanced at Jamal, then at Denise, her eyes filled with resentment she could no longer hide. It was just a game. But no one believed her. The murmurs swelled again, this time with admiration, not for her, but for Jamal. In that moment, Vivian realized she had lost more than a chess match. She had lost her audience. Jamal, oblivious to the politics swirling around him, tugged gently at his mother's hand. "Can we go home now?" he asked softly. Denise bent down, pressing her lips to his forehead. "Yes, baby," she whispered, her voice breaking. "We can go home." As they turned to leave, a man in a grey suit stepped forward. "Wait," he said. "Young man, what's your name?" Jamal paused, glancing up. "Jamal," he said quietly. "Well, Jamal," the man continued, "if you ever want to play again, I know people who would be honored to meet you." Vivian's face darkened, but she said nothing. Denise nodded politely, pulling her son close as they walked out of the glittering hall. The marble floors, the chandeliers, the whispers, all of it faded behind them. But something had changed. The boy who once sat quietly in the kitchen doorway had stepped into the light, and the world had seen him for what he was. Outside, under the night sky, Jamal clutched his battered chess book to his chest. He looked up at his mother and smiled. "Did I do okay, Mama?" Denise's throat tightened. She knelt, cupping his face in her hands. "You did more than okay, Jamal. You showed them who you are, and one day the whole world will know." And as they walked down the quiet street away from the mansion, the echoes of his triumph lingered. He was no longer just the maid's son. He was something greater, something undeniable. A child genius. And this was only the beginning.